In the era of 8-bit side-scrollers, when colourful platformers painted the gaming landscape with whimsy and cheer, one series dared to embrace the ghoulish, unleashing a torrent of demonic adversaries and a bone-chilling challenge that etched its name into arcade legend. Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins series, with its devilishly difficult gameplay and iconic protagonist Arthur, has haunted gamers for over 3 decades with a delightfully sadistic brand of retro horror that still sends shivers down the spines of the bravest players. Now, this wasn't because it was particularly scary, it was because it was tough as nails. Capcom is focused on keeping its classic games popular, regularly releasing collections of hits like Street Fighter and Mega Man. Recently, they released Capcom Arcade Stadium and its sequel, and they also brought back an old game series called Ghosts and Goblins, known as Makaimura in Japan, translating to Demon World Village. The original arcade game, created by Tokuro Fujiwara back in 1985, was a big deal back then. Fujiwara also worked on other famous Capcom games like Bionic Commando and Sweet Home. I can't even tell you how much pocket money I spent on Bionic Commando trying to beat the game in the local arcade.
Yeah, but you've always been shit at games.
Give me a break, Ruby. I was only 7 years old.
So what's your excuse now?
Let's ignore her. Although Ghosts and Goblins was well known in the 80s and 90s, it's not as famous now, so I thought it would be a good idea to remind everyone about it. Early side-scrolling games like Namco's Pac-Land back in 1984 and Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. In 85 were cheerful and fun for sure, but Ghosts and Goblins had a much darker vibe. In this game, the hero is a knight named Arthur, whose girlfriend, Princess Prin, is kidnapped by demons led by the demon lord Astaroth. Arthur starts off with spears to throw, but as he progresses, treasure chests appear from the ground, providing him with different weapons like daggers, torches and axes. These would later change to crosses or shields in versions outside of Japan. Arthur begins wearing a suit of armour, but only a single hit will cause it to shatter, reducing him to his boxer shorts. Another hit will turn him into a pile of bones, sending him back to an earlier checkpoint.
Interesting fact, did you know that the game's creator, Tokuro Fujiwara, designed Arthur's underwear look as a form of humiliation for the player when their armour is destroyed? It was meant to be embarrassing.
Thanks, Ruby. In fact, I did not know that. The dark comedy in Ghosts and Goblins helps balance out its extremely tough difficulty. Arthur has limited health and movement. He can only throw spears straight ahead and can't change direction mid-jump. Enemies attack from all directions, and constantly respawning baddies like zombies make the game even more challenging. A particularly vicious adversary appears partway through the first stage, a red-winged demon named Firebrand, also known as Red Aronor in Japan. He likes to hover just out of reach of Arthur's attacks, then swoop in suddenly to launch an assault. Introducing such a troublesome character so early in the game sets the tone for the rest of the adventure, which only gets harder from then on out. We also get shown a level map that highlights Arthur's journey, teasing later areas that the player may never reach, an element reused in many later games like Castlevania. When you eventually complete the game though, it's not over. There's one last kick to the nads for old Arthur. Once you've managed to get through the game's 6 stages and beat the final boss, you learn that you've been tricked by Satan and need to replay the entire game at a higher difficulty in order to get the real ending. It ensures that you'll have every level completely memorised by the time you actually rescue Prin, presuming that you're up for the challenge. Subsequent games keep this element as well, requiring that you obtain a special weapon on the second playthrough before you can conquer the final boss. This has been implemented in modern games also, and is often referred to as New Game Plus. Look at titles like Resident Evil for example. Oftentimes a second or third playthrough is more fun as you can start a new game with better weapons or some cool new features or outfits.
Yeah, but the difference is, back then it was more of a necessity due to the system's memory constraints. It was a way for the developers to keep the player engaged and wanting more.
Even though Ghosts and Goblins was a very hard game, it became really popular. People loved its unique look, especially the creepy smiles on the enemies. The catchy main tune by Ayako Mori also made the game memorable.
Hang on, I've got another fact if you want to hear it. The creepy smiles on the enemies that you mentioned was inspired by a movie from 1922 called Nosferatu.
Because it was so popular, the game was made for many home systems. In 1986, a version for the Famicom and NES was made by Micronix, a company that also worked on other early Capcom games like 1942 and Sun Sun. These versions usually had many glitches and gameplay problems, and Ghosts and Goblins was no different. However, the main experience of the game was still there. The game was also made for many home computers like the Commodore 64, which had a completely different but excellent soundtrack by Mark Cooksey. A sequel to Ghosts and Goblins came out 3 years later in 1988. In Japan it was called Daimakaimura, which means Great Demon World Village, but everywhere else it was known as Ghouls and Ghosts. The main idea of the game stayed the same, but there were several improvements. Now you could throw lances both up and down. Besides the usual weapons, you could also find a golden suit of armour that let you charge up a powerful magic attack depending on the weapon you had. However, there was a tricky surprise. Some treasure chests had evil magicians inside who could curse Arthur, turning him into a duck or a baby. Neither of these forms is very good for fighting zombies and other undead creatures. This sequel was made using Capcom's more powerful CPS-1 arcade board, which made a big difference. The game had richer colours, higher resolution, and more detailed backgrounds. This also allowed for larger bosses, like the stone statue at the end of the first stage that takes off its fire-breathing head and attaches it to its arm. There was also a giant insect boss that looks like the Omu from the anime movie Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. The ultimate enemy though, Lucifer, is as big as the screen and sits on a huge throne. In a later interview with the Ghouls and Ghosts staff revealed that most of the development team for this sequel was different from the original except for Fujiwara. The new team members were fans of the original game and had their own ideas to make it better. They also mentioned that the original Ghosts and Goblins was the first game they knew of to feature zombies, which is funny since zombies are now common enemies in modern games.
I know, right? Everywhere you look now there's a damn zombie game.
There are many versions of games from Ghosts and Goblins series, including the polished Super Graphics port of Ghouls and Ghosts, and the Japan-only Arthur to Astaroth no Nazumaikimura Incredible Toons. One of the first ports of Ghouls and Ghosts was for the Sega Genesis, created by Sega itself, with Yuji Naka as the main programmer. While it wasn't a perfect port, it showed that the system could closely match the arcade experience. The huge bosses in the game were a big selling point in advertisements for the Sega Genesis. Another port was made for the NEC Super Graphics in Japan. It was one of the 6 games released for that platform and it was solid, though not as impressive as other versions. Ghouls and Ghosts also appeared on various European computer platforms, with notable soundtracks by the famous composer Tim Follin. A unique version for the Sega Master System introduced a new upgrade system to enhance different abilities. This version has never been released anywhere else and is now a rare collector's item.
So, if you happen to find a copy of this up your mum's attic, you could be looking at a bit of cash.
The third game in the series, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, called Chumekamura or Super Demon World Village in Japan, didn't have an arcade version. Instead it was made for the Super Nintendo in 1991. In this game, Arthur gets a double jump, making him a bit easier to control, though he can no longer attack vertically. To balance this, there are more armour upgrades to find, including shields. With 8 levels in total, it's a bit longer than the previous games. However, like many early SNES games, it has some technical issues and significant slowdown. This game wasn't ported as widely as the earlier titles. It did appear on the Capcom Generations 2 compilation for the PlayStation and Saturn, which fixed the slowdown and included the arcade versions of the earlier games. It also appeared on various PlayStation 2 and Xbox compilations. A Game Boy Advance port adds some extra stages from earlier games, and a Japan-only release for the WonderSwan portable console includes elements from all three titles. After the SNES game, the Ghosts and Goblins series took a long break, with only a few spin-offs released during that time. It wasn't until 2006 that the series came back with Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins, now called Goku Makimura or Extreme Demon World Village for the PlayStation Portable. Capcom had already updated Mega Man and Mega Man X for the PSP with 2.5D visuals, and they took a similar approach with this game. Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins is a brand new fourth entry in the series, not a remake. The visuals are quite impressive, but the game has some issues with hit detection and runs at 30 frames per second, making it not as smooth or precise as the older games. But what stands out the most are the many changes to the core gameplay. The developers seem to think that a super difficult arcade-style game wouldn't be as popular in 2006, so they redesigned it to be more of a treasure hunt. While it's still level-based, you now need to explore each stage to find all the rings, which unlock the final area. Some rings can't be reached until you get a special ability later in the game, so you have to revisit previous stages to get them. There are also many new types of armour and magic, some of which give Arthur a proper life meter. The game even lets you continue from the spot where you died, though you still have to keep track of your lives. There is an arcade difficulty level that makes the rules more like the older games, but the focus on exploration makes this entry feel very different from all the others. Capcom felt the disappointment of longtime fans, and a year later, in 2007, they released Goku Makimura Kai. This edition included a completely rebalanced mode that turned it into a linear arcade-style game, along with the original modes. However, this version was not released outside of Japan, so international fans had to use import shops to get it. Fortunately, there isn't much text in the game, so language barriers weren't a big issue. Technically, this marked the end of the mainline Ghosts and Goblins series, except for two mobile spin-offs called Gold Knights and an online game from Korea that only lasted for 2 years between 2013 and 2015. However, the spirit of the series continued in various spin-offs. One notable spin-off featured Firebrand, an iconic enemy from the series, who got his own game for the Game Boy back in 1990. The game was called Red Armor, Makimura Gaiden in Japan, but its connection to the Ghosts and Goblins series was less clear in the international release, known as Gargoyle's Quest. The cover of the international version even recoloured the famously red demon to green. Despite still being set in the demon world, Gargoyle's Quest was aimed at the younger Game Boy market and wasn't nearly as difficult as the main series. Firebrand, the main character, had a different moveset than Arthur. While his flying skills weren't as strong as in the mainline games, he could briefly float and cling to walls. He also had several upgrades that offered different types of projectiles and other enhancements. Additionally, the game included some RPG-style segments where you could walk around and talk to other inhabitants of the demon world. This added a new layer of depth to the gameplay, making it distinct from the more straightforward action of the main series. After the first game, they made another one called Gargoyle's Quest 2. It was released on the NES in different countries. In Japan, it was called Red Armor 2 for the Famicom and Makimura Gaiden the Demon Darkness for the Game Boy. Then, they made a third game called Demon's Crest for the SNES. It has a cool feature where you can move around on a map screen and Firebrand, the main character, can turn into different forms. The first two games were made for less powerful consoles, but Demon's Crest was made for the SNES, so it looks and sounds way better. It has really cool dark graphics and music that makes it different from the usual cute games on the SNES. One of the weirdest spin-offs is called Arthur to Astaroth no Nazo Makimura Incredible Toons, which means Arthur and Astaroth's Puzzle Demon World Village. It's based on a puzzle game called Sid and Al's Incredible Toons by Dynamics, which is a fun cartoon version of their game, The Incredible Machine. In this spin-off, players have to use tools and machines to solve puzzles, all with characters from Ghosts and Goblins. Even though the original game was American, this one was only released in Japan for the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Another spin-off is the Maximo Duology, but it's more like a spiritual successor, meaning it's similar but not directly connected. It was made by Capcom's American branch called Capcom Digital Studios for the PlayStation 2 in 2001. In these games, you play as a knight named Maximo, who fights against lots of zombies and other undead creatures. Kind of like Arthur from the original games. The Maximo games play differently because of the change in perspective, focusing more on sword fighting. They give a nod to Ghosts and Goblins by including its music and having Maximo end up in his boxers when his armour breaks. The artist Susumu Matsushita, who's famous for his Famitsu illustrations, gives the games a sarcastic feel with his exaggerated designs. Like the original games, Maximo is really tough, and you have to collect a bunch of coins just to save your progress. In 2003 they made a sequel called Maximo vs Army of Zin. This one had a bunch of robot enemies, improved some things and made it easier to play, but by then other games like Devil May Cry were more popular, so the Maximo series ended there. Capcom Digital Studios changed its name to Capcom Production Studio 8, and their next game was a remake of Final Fight called Final Fight Streetwise, but it didn't do so well, especially compared to their earlier games. Even though they're not as famous as Mega Man or Street Fighter characters, Arthur and Firebrand from Ghosts and Goblins show up in lots of other games. In SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters Clash for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, there are cards based on these characters. And in SNK vs Capcom, the Match of the Millennium, there's a fun little game with Arthur in it. Firebrand even gets to be a fighter in the game SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos. Both Firebrand and Arthur are playable characters in Ultimate Marvel vs Capcom 3 and Marvel vs Capcom Infinite. Arthur also shows up in the crossover RPG Project X zone on the 3DS. Even though it's not officially part of the Ghosts and Goblins series, you should definitely check out Loco Malito's tribute game Maldita Castilla, also known as Cursed Castilla. You can play it on different platforms like the Switch and 3DS. It's inspired by Spanish legends and feels a lot like Capcom's games, but it's a bit easier to handle. Apart from the arcade versions that you can play in Capcom Arcade Stadium, you can easily find home versions of the games. The NES version of Ghosts and Goblins and Super Ghouls and Ghosts for the SNES are on Nintendo Switch Online and classic mini consoles. Also, Demon's Crest is available on Nintendo Switch Online. The Genesis and Super Graphics ports of Ghouls and Ghosts are on the Genesis/Mega Drive Mini and the TurboGrafx 16/PC Engine Mini respectively. Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins was never officially ported, but you can still download it for the PSP and PS Vita. The newest game in the Ghosts and Goblins series, called Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, came out in February of 2021 and got good reviews. People liked that it was really hard, just like the old games. The original creator of the series, Tokuro Fujiwara, worked on it, so it's a lot like the original games. Some people didn't love the way that it looks, but overall it keeps the special feeling of the Capcom games. Now we just have to hope that we don't have to wait too long for the next game to come out. Thanks for taking the time to watch my video. If you enjoy this type of content, be sure to say hi in the comments.
And why not go ahead and subscribe while you're there?
I'm Jack.
And I'm Ruby.
And we'll see you in the next video.